Jérôme, I wanted to have your view. There is, during the spring meeting of the IMF, the two main discussions were all about the potential unwinding of US monetary policies that we are going to have very soon, tapering, that emerging markets should be prepared. And you have been seeing a lot of economists talking about the fragile five, 5 countries, Indonesia, Turkey, Brazil, and others who maybe have not made enough reform, structural reform during the good times. You agree with that concept, or is it another, again, prejudice? And also you mentioned before, that in fact, we spend much time to look at vulnerability in emerging markets, but not in the developed countries. If you look at the Eurozone crisis, the way we manage the Eurozone crisis was quite different from the way we manage the Asian financial crisis. So what is your view on the scenario of this famous quantitative easing, that's the fact that we are going to have now the US Federal Reserve to act, that emerging markets should be prepared, that vulnerabilities is building up in the system, and we are witnessing that, and there is nothing that is being done at the global level. You mentioned also in your book that the only way that we are going to get growth in the advanced countries will be by reviving infrastructure. That's the only way, and to revive investment. So what is you thinking about how can we coordinate and orchestrate at the global level a global solution between maybe a sense of transition that we are facing, in the global macro level, and a sense that, the hegemonic power, the US, who used to be the one who was calling the shots, is maybe not anymore at the center of the decision making, and maybe less willing to act for the global public good. So how do you see this concept of fragile five, another prejudice, and why is maybe the major risk that we need to deal with, and how these countries are prepared enough to deal with any type of reversal of capital flow and other things that might happen in the
Well, first of all, the fragile five, yes, I think is just a marketing, just like BRICS was. When BRICS came out, when O'Neill coined that, however many years ago it was, I came out with cement, countries in emerging markets excluded by new terminology. and I do think, the fragile five is another way to frame our prejudice about these countries being more fragile and riskier than us. But if these countries are fragile, then frankly, the emperor has no clothes back in the ranch. If these countries are fragile, then the United States and Western Europe are frankly just a confidence trick. They're more than fragile. It's so fragile we daren't even talk about it. And where I think we've got ourselves to is because, I wrote something in 2011 about dead bodies, and if you'll excuse me, I'll give the analogy.
Please.
So we have this enormous debt which has been exposed, and in the UK we have this dead body, our debt, on the floor. We know it's there. It's going to take a long time to clear up, but we're trying to do that. In the Eurozone, they also have a big dead body. It's not in the German, on the German part of the kitchen floor, which is spotless, of course. It's all around the edges. And the Germans are being quite difficult because they're saying, why should we clear up everybody else's mess? Despite having all the cleaning equipment, they want proper rules. They want strong institutions. And they want to make sure that this doesn't happen again. So there's a roaring row about this. Why don't you just clear up the mess? No, you have to have strong institutions first. We don't want that. Just clear up the mess. And the consensus has been to get a sheet and to put the sheet over the body. Unfortunately, the blood is seeping and is getting into the shoe leather, and it's getting a bit sticky. So we agree to a bigger sheet, and then a bigger one. And we're all very smug. We're thinking that's solving the problem. It's not solving the problem. It's just putting off the problem. In the United States, of course, they've taken the dead body, put it in a chair, given it a cup of coffee, and are having a conversation with it. The denial is even greater. So I'm coming from the philosophy that, or the interpretation of recent history, that the problem is far from over. It has not been dealt with. I see quantitative easing not as a stimulant to the economy. It never was. It was, given the lack of government policy of intervening in the banks, it was the desperate and only measure that the central bank felt could keep the economy from depression. It was there just to bolster up the balance sheet of the banks, to push up asset prices so banks can issue more capital themselves. And of course, the capital itself has just gone around in a circle back to the central banks in form of excess reserves. And that's been the role of quantitative easing. It's not a confident policy. And it has worked. It has been very successful. Arguably, it's been continued too long. It should have gone back to fiscal authorities to play their part in a way which I think has been very disappointing. But the idea that we are therefore seeing new vulnerabilities, I think, is fundamentally flawed. We have the same vulnerabilities we had in 08, exactly the same. We're just what is changing is our perception of them is going up and down. And I think, again, we see a lot of this particularly in the US markets. We have days when stock markets and bond markets go up on the same day, and I feel sorry for the journalist, on the Wire journalist, who at the end of the day has to find a reason for this. And he phones up several people in the market and asks them what they think was going on, and some credible explanation comes about. That is written down, people read it, they accept that that's what happened. This is not a market environment of people really understanding what's going on. I take the view that unless you understand the history and the global imbalances and this terrible problem of how to cope with the debt, and of course the policy response to that will be some combination of financial repression, and if that fails, inflation, as well as cost-saving measures. Obviously, reducing the benefits to one's own pensioners is key on the list. But these are the policies which are being implemented and will continue to be implemented, whilst at the same time we have the strong urge, the motive of central banks to tell everybody that everything's basically okay. And the markets have fundamentally misinterpreted this entire dynamic. And so as a result, we do get this volatility of feeling. And likewise, to talk now about your question about quantitative easing, I think people misinterpret quantitative easing and its impact on the emerging world. For me, quantitative easing first of all, there's no way at all that the United States or any other government is going to subjugate their domestic needs for international needs when it comes to monetary policy. It's completely unrealistic, never happen. I mean, this is what Triffin we talked about originally. We've known this for a long time. So that's unrealistic.
And you said in your book, I remember, that some countries are very closed economy, like Brazil. So
yes.
The spillovers.
Yes. So Brazil, the first country to complain about quantitative easing, really, for me, quantitative easing is a bit like bad weather. Why don't they just get their umbrella and stop complaining? I mean, I'm an Englishman, it doesn't stop me complaining about the weather all the time. But that's what it is. I see it in that context. This is not a major structural issue. This is nothing like as important as reform of the international monetary system. It's nothing like as important for Brazil as their own structural problems. Almost all the problems in Brazil are homegrown. And they have they need $1 trillion of infrastructure investment. They can't do that with public money alone. They need to have private sector. There are all sorts of things they can do. But complaining about the foreigner, in this case quantitative easing, is really, I think, just a knee-jerk reaction to not wanting to solve their own problems. And I think a lot of emerging market response to quantitative easing is in that mode. I don't see quantitative easing as fundamentally something which need affect them. It will affect them, it does affect them, but it is something that there is a policy response to. And I think the big difference between emerging markets today and the developed countries is that the emerging markets have a much, much wider array of tools.
That's right.
The developed countries really don't, and so they need emerging markets understanding and forbearance. And I think countries like China have delivered that in spades. What I think is a little disappointing is at the same time we haven't seen, and as you mentioned in your question, the real opportunity. I see two things today that we didn't have in the 1930s. One, Keynes invented macroeconomics, so we should know better. And the other thing is we have the emerging markets as a potential source of aggregate demand on a global scale, and specifically infrastructure and the built environment.
But you would be more worried about China slowdown for emerging markets than the US quantitative easing coming to an end.
Well,
you think that emerging markets should be more worried about the real effect of China maybe slowing down?
No, I don't think so. Yeah. Because yes, of course, we can all worry about whatever we want to worry. But in terms of the scale of things, China slowing down is very small compared to the risks still facing developed countries, in my view. And by the way, China is a pretty well-run economy. They have, long periods of time when they are deciding what the policy should be. There are obviously lobby groups and all the rest of it. But once they decide to act, they are reasonably efficient. And I would say of all countries in the world, developing and developed, China has done more towards implementing the structural reforms needed in the new environment post-08 than any other country. It has been moving away from an export model towards a consumption model of growth now for a decade, I mean more than that. And what we see is a very perverse, to my mind, interpretation of these events. So you see articles in the press which talk about, oh, their exports are falling, their external opportunities are reducing, and so on and so on and so on. Therefore, they will have to depend more on domestic consumption. Is that going to happen? Whereas what I see is domestic consumption as being the future model of growth, which takes a long time to implement because you are having to incentivize savers to spend money. And that means you're having to give them some security in their old age, some assurances that they will not need to save as much. And that's huge changes. And that takes many years. Yeah. But I see that as the driving endpoint for then all these other policies, which then are looked at in this perverse way as meaning there's a problem. I see problems in China. I see potential problems, for example, obviously with the large levels of debt. But I think too many times people have not thought about the policy response possibilities in China. So we can take large local authority debts or off-balance sheet debts in the public sector in China more generally, and we can say this potentially has a problem. But why is it a problem? In the West, it would be a problem because if there's a sudden stop, then that can cause knock-on crisis effects. But that's not a realistic, it's not a major threat in China. If I take what I call bank and I rub out bank and I call it social expenditure department, suddenly the institution has a very different look to it. And yes, that doesn't mean that we won't see some defaults. We need markets to be created and tested. We need different views. And they're trying to build a secondary market. They are trying to build all the right things to create a vibrant private sector. But that's very different to thinking for a moment that they would let huge swathes of debt go into default and not do anything when they have all the capacity to basically bail out. And then that becomes not a micro-banking problem, it becomes potentially a macroeconomic national accounts issue. And then you look at the national accounts and say, well, is this going to create a big enough hole on the national balance sheet to create a significant change to the creditworthiness of the country? And the answer, of course, is no. Yeah. So when you think about China in terms of those macro and policy terms, I am really not very worried. I mean, I'm much more worried about lots of other countries, developed and developing, than I'm about China. But I think what's fascinating about China, it is the bugbear. It is the final refuge of those people who just stubbornly will not accept that the world has changed. And they want to have a reason to be worried about China, so they invent the new reason. I think there's a very interesting parallel here in 2002 in Brazil. After having seen the big default in Argentina in December 2001, there were people in New York who just felt that Brazil had to be next. They had an election, if you remember, yes. Lula was going to be elected. Now Lula is a man who is non-ideological. He got to where he was because he was a compromiser, very, very clearly if you look at his history. And yet he was paraded by his opponents in New York as being ideological and terrible. And so hedge funds got it into their head that the country was going to default, and they went short, and you then had a series of events. So first of all, the local companies were thought not to be able to repay their loans. They did. Oh, well, now we have to invent a new problem. The new problem was that they would go to the central bank and demand the dollars, and that would cause a problem at the central bank. Then, of course, the central bank, which was compliant in an IMF program, got $30 billion from the IMF, completely predictable. We have to worry about something else. So we'll worry now about the exchange rate not moving and that creating a trade balance problem without ignoring the effect on the trade balance. Eventually, after a whole series of iterations, and I would love someone to do a doctorate on this, just the history of how these excuses changed week by week or every other week, eventually the hedge funds realized that Brazil weren't going to default for at least 12 months. And that was longer than they could put the short on. And that, for me, was the end of the self-fulfilling prophecy in emerging markets. That was the last test. Of course, the real evidence came with Argentina's default, because every other country in the emerging debt market in the index rallied within 48 hours. That was just a relief. So contagion from emerging markets is gone in that sense. It really is gone. These countries are massively heterogeneous. The only thing they ever had in common was the fact that they were dependent on external finance. And insofar as we think that these countries still have that problem, I think we are deceiving ourselves. They don't. The fact that they are complacent, that the central banks with these reserves haven't been really using the reserves appropriately, has given the impression, I think, today of them being correlated, but they're not. Not in a way that you see massive correlation in developed markets where, of course, the leverage is so much greater, the misperception of risk is much greater. And that's why I worry about the developed world. And I think we can't really understand one without the other. And we live in a world where people are far too blinkered and they only think about the developed world. And emerging markets, as I said, completely periphery. It's not periphery. It's 85% of the world's population. It's over 50% of economic activity on the planet. And these are the countries, by and large, without the debt and without major of the problems and with the policy tools.